Welcome to the first podcast in Module 6, in which we will be exploring the Middle Ages. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. We're going to pick up with an image that we left off with when we were looking at the Roman Empire. This is the colossal head of Constantine. Now, if you'll remember, one of the things we talked about was the fact that this was stylistically different. It marked a shift in what we had seen before with more realistic-looking Roman sculpture. So I want to dissect that by talking a little bit about who Constantine was and what he did and why he was important to the Middle Ages and to art history in general. Constantine was a Roman emperor in the waning days of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was being threatened by forces of internal collapse as well as barbarians in Western Europe. And one of the internal factors in the Roman Empire was the fact that different emperors, different Caesars, were competing with each other. Constantine was in open conflict with another emperor named Maxentius. In fact, they were engaged in an open war that climaxed at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in the year 312. Now, keep in mind, during this time, Christianity is a minority religion in the Roman Empire, and both of these emperors are basically pagan when they meet on the battlefield. Supposedly, according to the story, the night before the battle, Constantine, the pagan emperor, sees a vision in the sky. He sees a Christian symbol, something called a Chi-Rho. We'll look at a picture of it in a second. And he sees under the Chi-Rho the words, "In this sign, conquer." And the next day he directs all his men to take this symbol, this Christian symbol, and inscribe it on their shields. And according to the story, that's what they do. And they go out the next day and defeat Maxentius. So Constantine becomes the emperor of Rome, and he attributes his victory to the God of the Christians, this upstart religious sect that is viewed with some suspicion by a lot of Roman society. There are rumors about them being cannibals, and that sort of thing. This, of course, is due to a misunderstanding of the Lord's Supper, but it was still used against them. Anyway, I digress. The point is, from Constantine on, Christianity becomes a protected religion in the Roman Empire. Up to this point, depending on the Caesar or emperor, Christians may have been tolerated or persecuted, depending on how severe the conditions were. But Constantine, again, having ascribed his victory to the Christian God, issues some laws that protect the Christian from persecution. Now, one of the things that's sometimes said about Constantine is that he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, which isn't quite true. He simply makes it a tolerated, protected religion. Other religions are legally practiced during Constantine's reign besides Christianity. But Christianity has a new special status in the Roman Empire. And what we see in successive emperors is more and more appropriation of Christianity until it becomes the only legal religion in the Roman Empire. Let's look at the next picture. This is an image. You can actually see this at the Vatican if you go there. This is a depiction of the Battle of Milvian Bridge, or more accurately, the night before the battle. And there Constantine is emerging from his tent, and you can see his entourage all around him. And there in the sky, he sees a cross. This is a detail that's actually disputed. What many historians say that he saw was actually a Christian symbol called the Chi-Rho, and you can see it in this next picture here. It consists of two Greek letters, the chi, which looks like an X, and the rho, which looks like a P, and they're stacked on top of each other. Both of these examples of Chi-Rhos also feature the alpha and omega inscriptions. You can see that A-looking thing on the left, and then the W-looking thing is actually a way of expressing the letter omega. By the way, the reason the Chi-Rho is a Christian symbol is because it is the Greek letters, the first two Greek letters in the Greek word Christ. So there you have it. Now, Constantine himself eventually becomes a Christian. There's some scholarly debate about when exactly that happened. but he definitely mainstreams Christianity in the Roman Empire. In fact, he decides to kind of get a new start. He leaves Rome, abandons Italy altogether, and moves out east. He decides to start his empire in a new city, a city that eventually takes on his name, the city of Constantinople, which of course is now Istanbul, and you probably are familiar with that if you listen to the band They Might Be Giants in the 1990s. Here's a map showing where he moved. You can see on the left-hand side of the map, we see the heel of the boot of Italy, and then moving further east, we see Greece. And then finally, we get into Asia Minor, and you can see there's the Black Sea, and the city of Constantinople can be seen there, located at the Straits of Bosphorus. Now, this is a major move east. This is really far away from Italy, so it's kind of a fresh start for Constantine. And here in Constantinople, we see the Byzantine Empire arise. It takes its name from the old city of Byzantium, which actually Constantinople replaced. In many ways, the arrival of Constantine on the scene marks the beginning of what we call the Middle Ages, a period of time between, about 300 and 1400, depending on who you ask. And this is called the Middle Ages because it occurs between the great classical times, the era of Greece and Rome, and the Renaissance. And that's kind of derogatory if you think about it. It almost makes it seem like a really long waiting period until the next good thing arrives. Be that as it may, the Middle Ages, what we're going to study in the second podcast, was a time of really great architecture and deep religious belief. In fact, the Middle Ages, or medieval period, is often referred to as the Age of Faith. And most of the art and architecture we're going to look at is created for the church and for Christian clients. So Byzantine art, this first strain of medieval art, is going to be happening in the East. This is going to be different from what happens in Western Europe in places like England and Italy and France and Spain. It's going to have more of an Eastern flair. You're going to have this mixture of East and West. You're going to have domes, for example, on your buildings, which is a very Eastern thing. You're going to have a portrayal of the human figure that mixes some more Oriental influences with Western influences. So let's look at some Byzantine art. And a typical starting place of Byzantine art is a very famous building that is in Constantinople, present-day Istanbul. This is called the Hagia Sophia, which translated means Holy Wisdom, which is a pretty sweet name for a church, the Church of Holy Wisdom. This was commissioned by the Byzantine emperor at the time. This is after Constantine, a guy named Justinian I, and he commissions a couple of mathematicians to design this for him. And it is a grand expression of both religious faith and also a mixed sort of political power. So it's very much a mixture of church and state. Now, if you look at the images here, we have the exterior of the Hagia Sophia. You might see some unusual things for a Christian structure. Note, for example, that there are 4 prayer towers at the 4 corners of this building, which associated with Islam. These are minarets. And of course, these were not originally on the structure. Later, this building fell into Muslim hands, and it was set up as a mosque. Now it is more of a historical site and museum than any sort of worship space. But it's interesting how worship structures can be used by different religions. We see that with things like the Parthenon in Athens. Same thing happened with the Hagia Sophia. So Justinian commissions this, and it's this really grand building. But what's really awesome about it is the interior. Here's an image of the interior. You can see the climax of the interior is this big dome, and the base of the dome is pierced by all of these windows. And when the sun shines in, it almost seems like the dome is floating on a halo of light. Light comes in and bounces off the gold on the walls and strikes the eyes of the viewers, and this has impressed people for hundreds of years. In fact, a historian named Procopius said this about the Hagia Sophia. One would declare that the place were not illuminated from the outside by the sun, but that the radiance originated from within. Such is the abundance of light which is shed about this shrine. Justinian himself, the emperor who commissioned this building, supposedly when he walked into it said, "Solomon, I have vanquished thee," which makes him sound like not a very humble sort of guy, which you get that idea with some artwork that we're going to look at in a second. But let's look at the Hagia Sophia a little bit more. Here's a set of interior images. We've backed away from the dome a little bit. You can see more of the inside. Again, all aglitter with gold. And you can also see some shields or sort of banners in place that have Islamic calligraphy on them, harkening back to the days when this was a mosque. Now keep in mind, this building, the Hagia Sophia, is an expression of Eastern Christianity. The style of the architecture is going to be different from what we are going to see in Western Europe, because this is a blending of East and West. In this next image, we have a picture of the guy who commissioned this thing, Justinian I, and some of his attendants. This is what we call a mosaic. This is a picture that is created using little tiny tiles, square tiles of colored glass or colored tile. So this image is less like a painting and more like a jigsaw puzzle. Now let's look at sort of the content of this picture. We have Justinian there in the middle. He's surrounded on his left-hand side by some priests, and on his right-hand side some soldiers. So this image represents a consolidation of church and state. He is bringing all power under himself and kind of combining the two in a Christian entity. Notice the shield of the soldiers has the Cairo symbol on it, which should remind us of Constantine. And we see some of the priests holding a book, presumably some scriptures. And another holds an incense dispenser. If you go to a Catholic or Episcopal church, you might see, or an Orthodox church especially, you might see someone swinging this thing and smoke's coming out of it, giving off a good smell. So those are priests holding priestly things. Justinian himself has a halo around his head, suggesting sainthood or divinity of some sort. And he's holding a bowl that contains the bread of the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, or communion. So again, very much a mixture of church and state. Now, I want you to look at how these figures are depicted, and I want you to compare them in your mind to, say, the figures from Pompeii, and also relate them to the sculpture of Constantine. What we have in the Middle Ages is a turning away from the humanism of the Greeks and to some extent the Romans, and as a consequence, the depiction of the human figure gets less realistic during the Middle Ages. Now, this is not necessarily what we might expect. Normally, we might expect, as we get along in time, for depiction of the human figure to get better and more convincing. But during the Middle Ages, we have kind of a regression in realism. And a lot of this just relates to the dominant philosophy of the times. Whenever people sort of have their eyes fixed on the spiritual world, typically the portrayal of the human figure gets less realistic. We saw this with the Egyptians, a culture that was obsessed with the afterlife. And of course, they had very stiff, unrealistic figures. And we see that again in the Middle Ages. In more humanistic times, like the classical era or the Renaissance, when humans are held in higher esteem, we typically have artists who actually study the human figure more and look at the world around them instead of trying to make up invisible spiritual things. And therefore, during more humanistic times, the human figure is more convincing and realistic generally. So think about, again, that sculpture of Constantine. The fact that he had these huge eyes on him makes him seem like a visionary. It seems to be a way of artistically expressing the fact that he had that vision on the night before the battle. And to me, I see that sculpture of Constantine as a very important transition point in the way the human figure is depicted between the classical era and the Middle Ages. But back to the mosaics. These stylistically have some kind of quirky things about them. Look, for example, at the figure's feet. They almost seem like they're standing on tiptoe, and in some cases look like they're stepping on each other's toes. They're kind of floating there in space. Look at the way their robes hang. They're very flat and stylized. We don't have this really convincing sense that there are real bodies underneath these robes. They almost seem like angels floating in the ether. So there's very much an otherworldly, almost super spiritual sort of style going on here, where these don't really feel like real people who occupy the real planet Earth. This next mosaic we see is an image of Justinian's wife and queen, the Empress Theodora, and some of her attendants. And again, we have a figure with a halo, and she is carrying the other part of communion. She's carrying the cup that has the wine, and she too is surrounded by attendants. We also see a baptismal font. This is going to be the bowl that has the holy water that people are baptized in back in the day. And again, we have the flat-looking robes, the stylized lines that depict folds in fabric that almost seem like there's just a ghost or an angel underneath this clothing. Here is a close-up of the mosaic of Theodora, and it'll give you a little more insight into how these mosaics were put together and why they're so amazing, being a pretty detailed picture when you back away from them, but when you get up close, you see these individual little colored tiles that have been set in place to make this look convincing from a distance. There, if you go to St. Peter's in the Vatican, you walk in and you look up at the ceiling, and there are these amazing images of saints, and then you can take stairs and kind of go up and walk around the inner dome and get close to these paintings, and it turns out they're not paintings at all. They're actually mosaics. So mosaics are a really impressive high art form. And the Byzantines do mosaics really, really well. It's kind of their thing, one of the things they're known for. This next image shows another thing that Byzantine art is known for, and that is the icon. Now, an icon is simply a religious image that is usually associated with the Eastern Orthodox Church. It normally depicts some sort of saint. In this first case, we have Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus, theoretically, baby Jesus, but he looks kind of like a little man. And icons are small images that are used as sort of devotional tools. Often, Orthodox Christians will pray while looking at an icon. The idea being that this helps you focus and keeps your mind from wandering. It also serves the purpose of standing in for people who are in heaven, reminding you of the cloud of witnesses of holy people who have died and gone on before you and are now in the presence of God. The word icon actually comes from the Greek word icon, which simply means image. Now, if you go to an Orthodox church nowadays, you'll often see a lot of icons. And sometimes people in the congregation will come up and they will kiss these icons, which has led some people to charge Orthodox Christians or Eastern Christians with committing idolatry. And of course, these people would say idolatry is the last thing we want. We know that this piece of wood is not God. We know it's not a person. We know it's just a piece of wood. But the Orthodox have a philosophy called veneration. And in this idea of veneration, any sort of reverence that you render to an image, like an icon, is transferred to the person that represents. So if you kiss an icon of Jesus, an image of Jesus, the Orthodox believe that that honor passes on to the person that is represented by the icon. It's almost like the icon is a window through which we can see into the spiritual realms. Now, you can take it or leave it. I'm not saying you have to use icons in your devotional life, but it's kind of an interesting expression of Byzantine spirituality. Let's look at some individual icons. This first is a super famous icon called the Vladimir Madonna, or the Vladimir Theotokos. Theotokos being a fancy word that means God bearer, describing the Virgin Mary, who literally bore God in her womb, one of the great mysteries of Christianity. And this is a wonderfully intimate sort of image. Here we have Mary holding Jesus, and she's pressing his cheek to hers. And not only is this just a great depiction of Mary and Jesus, it's a wonderful kind of universal depiction of motherhood and the tenderness that can form between a mother and her child. Now, one of the things you might notice as you look at icons is they are definitely unrealistic. The faces have distorted features, often very long noses and small mouths. You look at this image of Jesus, he has a really long neck. This is all symbolic imagery. It's not intended to depict what these people actually look like. Instead, it's supposed to communicate invisible spiritual truths about these people. Essentially, a window into heaven. Now, before we move on from the Vladimir Madonna, I should say that this is one of the most famous artworks in Russia. This is basically an icon of Russia. We don't know who made it, but it's a really old, really famous image. And it has such a grip on the Russian imagination that there's a story from World War II when the Nazis were marching on Moscow. Supposedly Stalin ordered that this icon be placed in an airplane, and the airplane fly circles around the city for sort of mystical spiritual protection. And this is Stalin. This is like total atheist guy doing this. So that just suggests some of the power this had for believers and non-believers alike. Let's look at another super famous icon. This is the icon of Christ Pantocrator. This is from St. Catherine's Monastery, which is located at the foot of Mount Sinai in Egypt. And the word Pantocrator is a fancy word that means ruler of all. So this is a depiction of Christ essentially ruling over the universe. So it's not a depiction of Christ as the man of sorrows or Christ about to be crucified, but Christ sort of all-powerful, almighty. And this is the earliest image of Christ as a Pantocrator, as the ruler of the universe that we know of. It's earlier than the Vladimir Madonna. This is from 700. And this is just a marvelous image because of the theological stuff that this is getting at. I want you to do a little experiment with me. I want you to take your hand and cover up the left-hand side of Christ's face, so his right hand, our left, and cover up half of his face and look at the expression on the right side of his face, his left, our right, and ask yourself, what kind of emotion does that convey? And based on the way the eyebrow is kind of arching and the eye itself is kind of narrowed, there seems to be something almost stern and serious and even angry about this half of Christ's face. Now move your hand over and cover up that side of his face and look at the left-hand side, our left, his right, and notice the expression changes. It's gentle, it's benevolent, it's kind. This seems to be an attempt on the iconographer's part to get at the different sides of the nature of Christ. He's fully God and he's fully man. He is both judge and savior or redeemer. So again, there's a lot of interesting theology embedded in these images. His hand is lifted in a sign of blessing to us, and he holds a book of scriptures. Perhaps it's the book of life. But just remember that icons are not intended to be realistic. They are intended to be symbolic images. And the Christ Pantocrator of St. Catherine's is definitely one of my favorites. In continuing our tour of famous icons, here's the other one you need to know about. I'm trying to pick like the best, most famous ones. This is by a Russian iconographer named Andrei Rublev. It's called the Holy Trinity. It's a lot more recent. This is from the 1400s. And what's interesting is that the style of icons really doesn't change very much. If you compare the Christ Pantocrator and this one, in fact, the Pantocrator even looks a little more realistic. The point, if you are making an icon, is not to be original. The point is to create this spiritual image, and your originality and your creativity are not really supposed to get in the way. The icon, remember, is a window. into the heavenly realms, and you don't want the person who's looking at it to get distracted by how cool of a style you have or how creative you are. This image depicts three angels, and this is reenacting a story from the Old Testament in which three visitors come to Abraham and Sarah and tell Abraham that he's going to bear a son. And the early church interpreted these three angels as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So it's kind of interesting because this is sort of a pre-incarnation image of Christ. Now, we don't know that for sure. That's just a theory on the part of some Christians, but it's a pretty interesting theory. And Eastern Christians, or the Orthodox Church, believe that it's wrong to portray a picture of God the Father. It's okay to portray Jesus because Jesus actually came as a man, so we have the right to make pictures of him. But nobody knows what God looks like. So for a long time, there was a ban on portraying God. However, icon writers, as they're called, because they believe that when you make an icon, you're sort of writing a prayer. You're not even really painting an original picture. Icon writers get around this prohibition against portraying God through things like this, depicting the three angels who visit Abraham in the belief that these are God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit actually come to earth in human form. So that's kind of a funny theological loophole that icon writers are taking advantage of. Now, the last two images we're going to look at are just contemporary icons, icons that were made in the past 10 or 20 years. Both of them are by Konstantin Zlatev, and both of them are totally Byzantine in their stylization. And this really drives home the point that the style of icons does not change. The point is simply to be a faithful sort of renderer of this prayer if you are an icon writer. It's not to let your own creativity and originality get in the way. So we have an image, a contemporary image of Christ Pantocrator, and we have another image of the Virgin and Child. Kind of contemporary echoes of those first two icons that we saw. Really interesting. All right, that's going to wrap up all we have time for with Byzantine art. Keep in mind that all of this art is happening in the East. These are Eastern expressions of medieval Christianity. And so the question that should be sort of forming in your mind is, what was happening in the West? What was happening in places like Italy, France, Spain, Germany, and England during this time? What did the Middle Ages look like in Western Europe? And our next podcast is going to delve into that.